A little background of our text this morning from chapter 47.
Yes.
Uh, Here, Jacob is going into Egypt. Egypt has always played a really significant part of the scriptures and of prophecy and of history. Abraham went to Egypt to escape a famine. Then after Abraham, Joseph was sold by his brothers into slavery into Egypt. Moses later on was born there and delivered the people out of the bondage of Egypt. And then a century or two later, Joseph and Mary escaped into Egypt with the child Jesus. We don't know for sure how long they stayed there, but this is pure speculation on my part. They went there quite wealthy. Incense, gold, myrrh, those are extremely valuable treasures. So they were able to survive there, I think, comfortably. Most likely, they went to Alexandria, which is probably, it was the largest and most prolific library in the world. And so without doubt, they had an impact there. And the oldest known existing church in the world is the Coptic Church that began in Alexandria. And it's still going today in this basically dominant Muslim country. The church is still functioning there. And tradition says that Mark, the writer of the gospel, planted that church in Alexandria, Egypt, and it spread throughout Egypt. Even today, the Coptics are probably the most persecuted of Christians throughout the world, with established accepted churches. Of my travels, the only time I was ever fearful was in Cairo, in Egypt. The day I got there, we're in this high-rise 10-story building, meeting with, we called them partners, which were underground missionaries. We actually had a TV station in that building, in a closet. And it's a long story, but anyway, the day I got there, one of the local pastors had committed suicide. He jumped out of a 10-story window with his hands tied behind his back. But it was suicide. So anyway, Egypt has always played a crucial part. Now, Ezekiel says, I think it's around Ezekiel 29 or 30, it will never, ever reach its former glory again. And it never has. At the time of Joseph, and it was Joseph who really made the pharaohs prosperous in his work. In this chapter, a little bit of a background, background. After he's introducing his dad, his brothers, etc., which we'll read in just a moment. Then he goes on, because of the famine, it's 2 years into a 7-year famine, and he starts to sell grain. That's why his brothers came to buy grain. So he's doing all this literally. It's almost a modern day business scheme, if you would, or the guy with the money buying up everything. He buys up all the land. Then he does this land acquisition, and he starts expanding Pharaoh's influence, and then he even establishes a serfdom, where you're going to work, and you work the land, it's Pharaoh's land now. You get to keep 80%, but 20% goes to Pharaoh. And then he buys up all the cattle and establishes the wealth of Pharaoh that didn't go away until modern day. And that was Joseph. He was beyond entrepreneurs. I mean, he built the wealth of Pharaoh unbelievably. And so that's where we are right now.
You know, as I'm thinking about you talking about that, you would have thought that the Egyptians would have passed those stories around and along about Joseph. But eventually, after so many life cycles, it seems like they forgot about Joseph and what he had done to make Egypt such a powerful nation. And then, you know, they see the Israelites as being
Well, how quickly we forget.
Exactly.
And the scripture is clear because
Yeah.
there was a Pharaoh who no longer knew or remembered Joseph.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a 400-year time span.
Yeah.
Anyway, real quick, I have all the McGuffey readers. The McGuffey readers were established in 1835 by Pastor McGuffey, and they were educational books. They're unbelievable. By 6th grade, you were reading things that I have a hard time reading today. Just unbelievable education. Bible stories, Shakespeare, the great authors and writers, and everyone had a moral content to it. And I posted a picture of one of my McGuffey readers and just one page of things that they were reading. And that's why that World War II generation was known as the greatest generation. That simplistic, moral-based, tough education that they had. I doubt, I'll say this reluctantly, that most high school students couldn't read the 3rd McGuffey reader, let alone the 6th. I'm a reader, and I'm reading the 6th grade McGuffey reader going, dang, I hope they have definitions. Anyway, so.
All right. So our scripture today is going to be from Genesis 47, verses 1 through 12. And it reads as such. Joseph went and told Pharaoh, my fathers and brothers, with their flocks and herds and everything they own, have come from the land of Canaan and are now in Goshen. He chose 5 of his brothers and presented them before Pharaoh. Pharaoh asked his brothers, what is your occupation? Your servants are shepherds, they replied to Pharaoh, just as our fathers were. They also said to him, we have come to live here for a while, because the famine is severe in Canaan, and your servants' flocks have no pasture. So now please let your servants settle in Goshen. Pharaoh said to Joseph, your father and your brothers have come to you, and the land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best part of the land. Let them live in Goshen. And if you know of any among them with special ability, put them in charge of my own livestock. Then Joseph brought his father Jacob in and presented him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Pharaoh asked him, how old are you? And Joseph said to Pharaoh, the years of my pilgrimage are 130. My years have been few and difficult, and they do not equal the years of the pilgrimage of my father. Then Jacob presented Pharaoh and went out from his presence. So Joseph settled his fathers and brothers in Egypt and gave them property in the best part of the land, the district of Ramses, as Pharaoh directed. Joseph also provided his father and his brothers and all his father's household with food according to the number of their children.
Just so I'll remember, we choose the text that we have based on questions being asked. And the 2 questions here is, what's your occupation and how old are you? I get that a lot. Old enough and retired. Anyway, point number 1. Have you ever had such a move in your life as Jacob had? Joseph went and told Pharaoh, my father and brothers, with their flocks and their herds, everything they own, have come from the land of Canaan. and then now in Goshen.
What did you say? Have you ever had such a what?
Pardon?
Move.
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 I think a lot of times, especially if you've read the Bible over and over again, and you know the stories, you know the events, you know how they end, we forget that they didn't. When Jacob was leaving Canaan, he's 100 and something years old, packing up everything, all their sheep and all their goats and their cattle, and wagon loads of people, 62 people, right? We said last week. And they move about at least 250 to 300 miles, never having been there before. Going thinking, well, Joseph said it's a 7-year famine, so we're 2 years into it. Well, we'll go there for 5 years. Wouldn't you have thought that? And then here, 400 years later, their descendants are leaving, whom also most likely didn't remember all these events. They weren't written in books. They didn't have, that we know of. They may have been, but we don't know that. A little bit of a testimony. Both Sherry and I are born and raised in Weirton. It's a stereotypical thing when you either graduated from high school, you went to college, or worked in a mill, and you got married. We did everything 1 month out of high school. We got married and went to the mill. Had a great job. 19 years old, bought our first home. Then in 1980, my brother calls and was stricken with MS and was quite a successful businessman. Tony, I want you to come and help me. So Sherry and I prayed, rented our house here, went to California, thinking that we'd be out there for 5 years, make a lot of money, and come back to work and open up a pharmacy. I bought an old Ryder truck. We let it to Beverly Hillbillies, going to California. Worked in Mexico for 3.5 years. The economy in Mexico fell apart. Just by a visit from a friend, ended up teaching at a Christian school. And here we are in the basement in Toronto, Ohio. And Sherry and I have said this, and what a great journey it's been, not knowing at the start where it would end. Never dreamed. I remember sitting with friends. We're moving to California. We'll be back in about 5 years. Well, 35 years later, we come back, having done things I never dreamed that we would ever do. And here is where Jacob and all of his brothers traveling. I'm sure the brothers are going, oh boy, Dad's going to really be ticked when he hears how Joseph got to Egypt. So, anyway. Anybody, you ever have a move?
Yes.
Or end up somewhere where you never planned?
So, but similar to yourself, I was married for the first time about 19, and was working, actually managing a grocery store, which is now the Walmart up in Monaca, Pennsylvania. And my first wife and I decided we were going to move to New Orleans. So we packed up a U-Haul and put it in the back of our car and everything we owned at that point in time. And we went down there, and her sister and her brother-in-law were living there. We stayed there, and I got various different jobs that really helped my career advance. And then we moved back, but we had no idea where we were going. We went down there, and we didn't have any jobs per se at the time, and we made it work, and it was a good learning experience. My son Robert was born down there. I still remember that. It's the best thing I took home from New Orleans. But there was a lot of uncertainty. We didn't know what to expect. And there was a time I remember when my first wife worked in a bank. And if anybody's worked in a bank, it's not a real high-paying job. and I lost my job, and we're living on basically bologna sandwiches every day for I don't know how long, but we made it through, and it was one of those things, you know. It's a little easier when you have your mom and dad handy if anything, you know, you ever need to lean on. But we were on our own, so we really learned quickly how to survive, and so it was a good experience, and it taught me a lot of things that I hold on to today. Actually.
I think the point is, all of us are where we are today. I wonder how many of us plan to be where we are today. Life kind of seems to happen. And when I think of Jacob and his family and this move, you know, they didn't load up the Winnebago. Pharaoh sent some wagons for them to move. So anyway.
Okay. Point number 2. Why did Joseph not bring all of his brothers? He chose 5 of his brothers and presented them before Pharaoh. Pharaoh asked his brothers, "What is your occupation?" Why do you think he picked these 5 brothers? Boy, he had some scoundrels, some of his brothers. They had done some pretty nefarious things to him. Now he's got to present them to the Pharaoh. And it's interesting that he chose 5. We talked about numbers a lot last week, and I think there's some significance with numbers. You know, Joseph had given Benjamin 5 times the amount of food. 5 represented God's grace in the Bible. It was a symbolic gesture in Egypt, in Egyptian culture, 5 was considered to be a sacred number. And so I think Joseph was trying to take advantage of this understanding he had of the culture because he lived there for a while, that perhaps 5 was a good number to find, you know, for Pharaoh to give him grace to accept and give him the favor that he was asking of his brothers to be able to go and take advantage of this opportunity.
Yeah. It's kind of fun to speculate, and that's all we can do. I think he took the 5 oldest ones that were responsible for selling them into slavery, just to get it. I told you about that, didn't I tell you? My first thought was maybe he took the 5 best looking. And if he was going to take the 5 best looking, I wonder why he didn't take Dinah. I mean, she was pretty, obviously.
Yeah.
And, anyway, any thoughts on which brothers and why? April 7th, we're going to be in chapter 49, where Jacob blesses his 11 sons. And we're going to look at those 11 blessings, because not all of them were blessings.
Hey, do you want to know what ChatGPT says? It says that he brought the shepherds and he left out the brothers that were involved in the plot. Now, not that that's biblical, but
Well,
it's been pretty spot on every time I've asked it a question.
yeah, me too. And I'm astounded. Yeah. ChatGPT is I use it often.
That makes sense though.
Yeah.
Those are the ones he chose.
And well, we could talk about that for quite a bit. Right now, there's no bias in ChatGPT that I found. I mean, some of the things it says are just pretty spiritually spot on. And what it's doing, it's looking at probably tens of thousands of documents simultaneously, instantaneously, and getting an accumulation of the available knowledge and making that assessment. Yeah. I think it's pretty amazing. Whether it ends up being the Antichrist or not, I'm not going to worry about that
Right.
until later.
I think at some point, I don't want to
I think
take
it
this
has to
route.
do with the name of it.
Yeah, well, it could be the Antichrist.
Do you think at some point in time that it's going to make us use our brains less, which is going to make us dumber in the long run?
I think it's the opposite. Someone asked Albert Einstein one time, how many feet in a mile? He goes, I don't know. You're the smartest man in the world. You don't know how many feet in a mile. He goes, I don't put anything in my mind I can look up. I have to look up my own phone number. All I have to do is ask my phone to call myself, or call you, call anybody. I think it gives you more space to keep things in a significant.
Well, I mean, like you said, your phone number, I mean, it's really, it's relevant, but it's not. You know what I mean? It's not something that you need.
Right.
The part of it
So
too,
I think it's the opposite, personally.
well, I think it stimulates you to think more because it brings up,
A
you know,
different,
topics or things that you never would have thought of before. So then you actually do more research, you do more thinking about it, trying to figure out your own truth. And so I think it actually would stimulate more thought process.
The one thing about it that I don't like is it doesn't like my writing. Has no taste. Number 3.
Acquired taste on
Stay in the back. Did Joseph, forgive me for some of the blanks, but did Joseph roll his eyes when his brothers responded? Your servants are shepherds. They replied to Pharaoh, just as our fathers were. Now, remember the instructions Joseph gave. Don't tell them you're shepherds, because the Egyptians despise shepherds. So he brings, now, Joe, you pick these 5.
the question before it, you have number 3, or smartest, I think we can scratch that off.
What caused their response? Now, first of all, in Genesis 46:34, you should answer, your servants have tended livestock as our fathers did. He tells them what to respond. Then you will be allowed to settle in the region of Goshen, for all shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians. And so, first, number 1, they were just dull. Prideful, honest, fearful. And now, the scriptures aren't real clear, at least to me. If you've checked, if anybody's checked, shepherds of herds, cows and domestic animals, and etc., and shepherds of sheep. And it's the shepherds of sheep that they despise. So maybe here the response was generic.
I did a little research on that. Yeah, and it said that one of the reasons was it was a historical thing, because the Hyksos, or shepherd kings, hundreds of years before Joseph's time, had invaded and conquered Lower Egypt and ruled the Delta, and they came from the east, probably Arabians, and they represented a cruel and arrogant race which subjected the Egyptians to great hardships, and they were finally driven out by kings. The other thing was the Egyptians were very meticulous about hygiene and cosmetics, and they were very intent on being very clean. The priests, they shaved all their body hair, all this stuff. They washed a lot. They kept their houses meticulously, and they felt that the linen that they liked to wear was much cleaner. It was a cleaner fabric than the coarseness and the oils that would have been in the garments that the Canaanites would have worn. And so that was one of the things they said, that material was quite smelly and nasty, and that was kind of one of the reasons why they were an abomination to them.
Okay, let's change the question just a little bit. Joseph, who's the savior of his whole family, is ruler of all of Egypt now under Pharaoh, who is most likely younger than Joseph. He brings his family. So now listen, guys, don't tell Pharaoh you're this. Tell him you're that. And they do the opposite. Well, I'm not gonna lie. No, you sold me into slavery. You know, you lied to dad for 10 years. So I don't think it was a noble thing. I don't, maybe prideful, arrogant, maybe.
And
So, go ahead.
didn't they worship, I mean, they had a bunch of different gods in Egypt. So I know they worship cows. Like Hathor was like the goddess, the cow goddess or something. So maybe it was something with the animals that,
I read that somewhere that sheep were part of the gods that they worshiped.
yeah.
But and if cows were as well, then what would it matter if they were shepherds of sheep or shepherds of cows?
Yeah.
So, and I think the main point is, if he would have said, you know, don't tell them you're plumbers
Mhm.
or whatever, they seem to have done the opposite. Whatever that
It would seem it would almost have to be fear, would make the most sense. Because they would have had to have appreciated his position, right? I mean, could they possibly think, he's our brother, he's gonna protect us, we're just gonna speak our mind and be prideful? That's hard for me to imagine.
Or maybe it was the opposite. Maybe they thought that we sold him to slavery. He's going to get revenge.
It's gonna double cross.
He wants us to double cross him. You know,
well,
hey, you lied to
then I
Pharaoh.
have to circle dumb.
Yeah.
I don't like the word dumb.
It might be cultural pride, you know, they don't wanna be mixed in with the Egyptians. They're like, this is who we are, you know, because think about they're the patriarchs, they're the ones who are bringing the child of promise, you know. That's the only thing they've been holding on to is Abraham's promise that the deliverer would come through them.
But they are deciding to go 250 miles and uproot their entire life. I'd hate to think they'd get on the doorstep and, you know, risk it for a prideful comment. I mean, they had to think that through, you would think.
Yeah.
But they didn't wanna get caught up in the Egyptians, they didn't wanna be like the Egyptians, they wanted to keep their own culture, their own separateness.
Sure.
They didn't want to walk like the Egyptians.
Yeah, and Goshen was on the edge of the Egyptian territory, so it wasn't in the middle of everything that was going on. They would be able to keep their religion and everything else without mixing in.
I just, the reason I use it, I could just picture go, oh, geez, guys.
Yeah.
Anyway, if any of the brothers made it to heaven, when we get there, we can ask them.
It could have been that I am what I am. When the question was asked, you know, Bill Miller was a steel worker. He made no bones about it. He called himself a mill hunky. If you ask him what he did, he said, I work in a mill. Now, he could have said, I'm an electrician, I'm, you know, all those things that he did in the mill, but I work in a mill.
I like when you started, I am what I am. Anybody know the rest?
Popeye.
It is what I is.
Popeye the same. As we regress,
Yeah, that would be kind of prideful, wouldn't it? You're proud of what you do, I guess, to an extent. I don't know.
I don't know if it's pride or just
That's who I am.
straight.
I bet it's one of the four.
Good guess. All right, number 4. Did Joseph's brothers usurp his authority? USURP. They also said to him, we have come to live here for a while because the famine is severe in Canaan, and your servants' flocks have no pastures. So now, please let your servants settle in Goshen. Should they have spoken, and if so, why? I feel like Joseph initially had to ask permission from Pharaoh for them to be able to do this. And then I think that he felt that Pharaoh would give him favor to allow his brothers to do that because of all the things he had done for the Pharaoh. And that's what he was hoping to transfer that favor from himself to the brothers. And again, back to what we said before, they wanted to keep them away from the rest of the Egyptian culture so that they could maintain their identity, if you will. Should they have spoken? If so, why? Or were they respectful, confirming, still a little brother, mistaken? Thoughts?
Have you ever been, anyway, have you ever been in a situation where you were being introduced, or you were part of an organization or a group of people, and I asked the question because I've been here and been the lesser in the group. My initial reaction when I'm in a group of, years ago, working in a steel mill, I was at the fire department, and they made me part of a group of managers that all we did was talk about safety. And these are, I'm a fireman. And so I would go to these meetings and I would just I'd be respectful. I wouldn't say anything unless I was asked. And usually when they ask me something, I just start sweating and go, I don't know. But Joseph gave them explicit instructions. And he brings his brothers and his dad. My question is, I have a hard time thinking anything noble of Joseph's brothers, other than Benjamin. So I
mean, they would have had them answer the question, I would think, there, right? Now, the way they answered it perhaps wasn't the best way, but it says, should they have spoken? Pharaoh asked them. I think, it would have been disrespectful not to speak, wouldn't it, at that point?
Joseph understood Egyptian, the brothers didn't. So if Pharaoh asked a question, it had to be translated for the brothers to answer. So that, I would say then, if there was a translated question, which it had to be, for them to answer, then probably right. I thought, everybody, are we delving into trivia? Are we going too deep? Sometimes of trying to figure out what was their motives. It's hard for me not to do that, but I think we need to look at the story as a whole, the propheticness of it, of what was happening.
There's always something we don't know.
Yes, sir. Man, there's always a lot I don't know. That's my favorite response. I don't know. Is it my turn?
Yes, good.
What am I, number 5?
5, please.
Okay, to whom did Pharaoh reply, and to why? Pharaoh said to Joseph, your father and your brothers have come to you, and the land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best part of the land. Let them live in Goshen. Why didn't Pharaoh speak to everyone? I think just a thought came. I probably just answered that.
Yeah, that's what
Because he spoke Egyptian.
Yep. There you go. That's perfect.
Okay, that's it. I do believe he respected Joseph immensely.
Well, how could he not?
Pardon?
I mean, how could he not? You know what I mean? With all that he's done for you.
Oh yeah, it just made Pharaoh extremely
Yeah.
wealthy. Yeah, he was not only the king of Egypt, he owned it.
Right.
I won't say anything political today. He was repulsed by them. Note he mentioned Jacob first. Bring your father. I kind of see, from what little we know of Pharaoh, I do lean toward him being a young man, maybe possibly even a teenager. But he was quite respectful, quite noble in everything he has done from Joseph coming to him from prison, I had this dream, and I don't know what it means, and making Joseph head over everything. Brett, go get your family. Here's some people to go get them. Meets with the king. So anyway.
Okay. Point number 6. To whom did Pharaoh show favor? If you know of any among them with special ability, put them in charge of my own livestock. When I read this, I thought about if Goshen was such a great pasture land, more than likely Pharaoh's livestock were in that same area, I would think. So it makes sense for them to, that had that kind of knowledge and ability to take charge. And Pharaoh obviously had a lot of confidence in Joseph, and he would find the right ones to watch over the livestock and take care of it.
The third point, I wonder if Pharaoh knew the story.
Even by Joseph being sold.
Yeah, I would almost think it'd have to. Well, how did you get here?
Yeah.
Those 5 guys I introduced. You really want them to take care of your livestock? Really, I would.
Yeah, that's true.
Again, we can only look at and understand what is actually revealed to us. We don't know when the brothers went back, did they tell Jacob what they had done? Joseph's now he's the head of all of Egypt. How did he get there? I don't know, Dad. Ask your oldest son. And then here with Pharaoh, I mean, obviously, remember when Joseph started crying and Pharaoh's house heard it? They were likely neighbors. It's hard for me to think that if Pharaoh would put all this trust in Joseph, that he wouldn't have asked of Joseph's background. I don't think I've ever hired anybody in a position that I didn't want to know who they were, where they came from, what their background was. So, anyway, more?
No.
Number 7. Why did Joseph present his father after his brothers? When Joseph brought his father Jacob into the presence and presented him before Pharaoh, after Jacob blessed Pharaoh, Pharaoh asked him, "How old are you?" Look at this. Think of this. He's got his 5 brothers and his dad. He's bringing them before Pharaoh, most likely in some opulent court. Wouldn't be surprised if Pharaoh's sitting on some kind of a throne, maybe. I can picture him surrounded by people with feathers, fanning everybody. And this is my dad. What does Jacob do? The first thing, he blesses Pharaoh.
Yeah.
The greater always blesses the lesser. And I think Nikolai, of everybody who knew his place prophetically, Jacob. I don't know. I don't know if the conniving brothers could understand all of that, but Jacob, he wrestled with God. God, put his hip out of joint and says, "I'm changing the name to Israel." Why? Because he wrestled with God. Think of who this guy is. A man that wrestled with God, the heir of Abraham and Isaac, the heir of the promise, who through him kings are going to be coming, and the Messiah was coming. So it was really something. So Joseph, these are my brothers, and Pharaoh, best for last, this is my dad. honor to whom honor is due, save the best for last, and the power of Jacob's word. I don't,
Jacob was the headliner.
yeah,
Jacob
Yes.
was the headliner. Here's the.
Kathy's right. Boy,
Here's
that,
here's the 5 opening acts, and ta-da, here's the headliner.
One of the things, part of that whole culture of respect for your elders. You know, he's the elder. And especially Pharaoh was young as
we're
speculating.
speculating,
Yes.
most likely.
I think he would be, respected because of his age. And as we go on and read, he'll tell us about a little bit more about his age.
Well, but before that, it said Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Your father and your brothers." He put the father first. I mean, would that play? You know what I mean?
While here, he presents him after.
Presented
Well, but Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Your father and your brothers have come to you." You know, Pharaoh put the father first,
Yeah.
and now Joseph is putting the father last.
Father's
I
most
like
important.
Kathy's remark. He's the headliner.
Oh,
And it
but-
really is.
And if you're gonna put on a show and you want people to come, you tell them about the headliner. You don't tell them, you don't make such a big deal about the opening acts.
Went to
So,
Chicago concert one time, and the opening act was the Allman Brothers, and they were much better than Chicago.
Those type of shows, yeah. So we're the opening act for Pastor Mark upstairs. Is that what we're doing?
Yes, yes, we are.
Okay. What was the testimony of Jacob to Pharaoh? Point number 8. And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The years of my pilgrimage are 130. My years have been few and difficult, and they do not equal the years of the pilgrimage of my fathers." Then Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from his presence. So Joseph settled his father and his brothers in Egypt, and gave them property in the best part of the land, the district of Ramses, as Pharaoh directed. Joseph also provided his father and his brothers and all his father's household with food, according to the number of their children. There's a lot of things in this little passage of scripture here. First of all, he talks about the years of his pilgrimage. A pilgrimage is traveling through an area, and obviously, I believe that Jacob knew that his real home was in heaven. It was an eternal home. It wasn't Egypt or Canaan or wherever else. I think he had his perspectives on that. He knew he was a citizen of heaven. He was, what I read was they said the average age in Egypt was 110 years old, that they lived through their life. So he's obviously past that threshold, but his father and his grandfather had surpassed his life and would surpass his life as he lived another 17 years, as he was 130 at this point. And he blessed Pharaoh twice. He gave him two blessings, which is kind of interesting. And the Pharaoh would have acknowledged Jacob as a man of God by accepting this blessing. I think that's another point that I read into that.
I mean, this is coming after the flood when God said, "My spirit will no longer contend with men for 120 years." The patriarchs are the only ones recorded in scripture whose lifespan exceeded that 120. That was favor in and of itself because they were the heirs of promise. They lived longer than other men. And everybody around them knew it because everybody else died. So there's something to be said about, the fact that somebody has lived longer than anybody else we know.
Yeah.
And then, Abraham was told, "You will bless all the nations." And I think Jacob was taking that very literally because Abraham blessed kings. Isaac would have probably blessed kings, we don't know. But Jacob blesses kings, because they pass on the blessings, just as we in the New Testament pass on the blessings as heirs of that promise.
I like the word pilgrimage as well. That that's through travel. And I hope we see our lives as that. I read a book, I think last week, called The Book of Charlie. Charlie was born in 1906, and he died one day before his 110th birthday. You think of the time spans, of the times of travel, of the change. Charlie literally went from horse and buggy to 50 years past a man walking on the moon. And he became a medical doctor. And when he became a medical doctor in the 20s, there was no cures. It was 90% of it was voodoo. I mean, it was, snake oils. The number one prescription to all illnesses: drink a lot of water and rest. Probably still pretty good even today. But this journey, the sojourn of his life. I just had some fun thinking. How old are you? I'm older than dirt. Life has been hard. You're kind of like Joe.
Yeah.
Work in the middle. Amen. I like that. I'm only 130. And Dad lived 180. Grandpa 175. And then he blessed him. So no more.
Yeah. So,
Next week, probably one of my favorite stories regarding Joseph. When Joseph brings his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, to Jacob. Jacob's almost like, "Who are these, my son?" And Manasseh was the oldest, and Ephraim was the youngest. And when he blessed him, he crossed his arms. And that prophecy really flows through the scriptures. I'm looking forward to next week. A trivia question. Anybody find the word in our word puzzle? I bet Carol
The
did.
dog ate
I
my,
was going to say that because she would figure it out that she.
Yeah.
Go to teach.
the
Carol,
dog ate my homework.
okay, I won't tell you what it is. Then I read that poem about Sunday school. It reminded me of our class. So
you know, read that story.
you're a better reader.
This is a poem from Tony, which is very appropriate, entitled Sunday School. In basement halls on Sunday morn, believers gather where faith is born. In ancient text and psalms embrace, they find their peace, a sacred space. In wisdom's light, seekers convene to ponder life, what scriptures mean. In fellowship, they share and pray, finding strength for each new day. It's a great analogy for our class.
Yeah, it's fun. Any questions, any comments, anybody? Thank you.
Have a snack,
Yeah.
please.